social divisions, political parties and civil society in post-communist Poland from 2001 and then 2003, written with Tadeusz Szawil, was awarded by the Polish Academy of Sciences. She has been a visiting professor at Stanford University, at the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the Johns Gutenberg University, Mainz. She was elected director of Public Opinion Research Center, first in 2007 and now for the term 2018-2023. Her most recent book on religiosity, it's God and the Polish Case, Beyond the Limits of Secularization Theory. I must say, frankly, a book which I admire. In her lecture titled Secularization in Europe, Theory and Reality, Professor Grabowska will examine the sociological theory of secularization and various theoretical approaches to the changes taking place in the religiosity of Western societies today. In this context, the lecture will outline empirical examples of the cause of the process of secularization in Western Europe and focus on the example of Poland, attempting to answer the question which factors actually influence the complicated process of changes in religiousness, which cannot be reduced, that's very important, to a deterministic relationship between modernization and secularization. Professor Grabowska, the floor is yours.
But I think I simply want to thank you for inviting me here. This is really great honor for me and quite an experience to lecture in the room where Saint John Paul II defended his PhD thesis. And I hope this place will help me with my lecture because okay. May I see the presentation?
Cominciare con...
Because the title of my lecture is very broad, and I selected from this wide-ranging subject matter, well, practically two topics. First, three theoretical approaches to the processes of change in religiosity, and I will talk about secularization theory, historical sociological approach, and individual biographical approach. Then about processes of change of religiosity in Poland, and at the end, modest conclusions. I wanted to comment on sociological data, which I will use during the lecture. However, I will skip it, and if some of you are interested in methodology of social research, we can come back to it later during discussion. Well, theoretical approaches to the processes of change in religiosity. I would like to begin stressing that the role of each theory is to describe and to explain phenomenon of interest, to describe in conceptual terms appropriate to the theory, and to explain, identify the causes, indicate the mechanism behind the phenomenon, determine the relationship into which the phenomenon enters. At the very beginning, I think I should warn you that these three approaches are much more stronger in describing these changes in religiosity and weaker in explaining these changes. Secularization theory has historical roots which I skip, and the classic version, contemporary classic version, was articulated in the 60s and the 70s. I would say that this theory blew up. Many books, many articles were published during a relatively short period of time, and it is even difficult to say who was the first and who was the founding father of contemporary version of theory of secularization, because there are many. Relatively quickly, this theory began to be criticized, but also nuanced, and I value David Martin and José Casanova, to whom I returned during my lecture, defended, but also continued and developed, continued by Ronald Inglehart and developed by David Boas. Generally speaking, the theory of secularization emphasized the role of the broader process of modernization and related factors. First of all, economic development, expansion of welfare system which provide existential security through healthcare system, social security which provides social security through social policies, etc., etc. I think Ronald Inglehart was the first, or one of the first, who tried to test it, this theory, and in his first book, The Silent Revolution, it was published in the 70s, he argued that with the transition from pre-industrial to industrial and post-industrial societies, there is a shift of people values from materialistic to post-materialistic values. And along with these changes, religious practices are declining. In subsequent books, he focused his attention more and more on religiosity. And in the last published book, I think the last, Religion, Sudden Decline, I send you the book, but I know that you have no time to read it because I send it too late. There are rankings of countries, tables, figures, diagrams, maps, which present result of his analysis. And I show you one map. They are easily available in internet, based on Inglehart results, I think elaborated by the second person Welzel, and it is based on the last wave of surveys, and there are two axes, the vertical one, traditional versus secular axis. We may call it religious and secular values, and the horizontal one, survival versus self-expression values. But when we think about this map, we can see also diagonal axis coming from African Islamic countries. This is the left down corner, to Protestant European countries, which are most secularized, and these societies share more self-expression, self-realization values. Poland is, I don't know whether I have green. Oh no. I wanted to show you Polish case, which is at the end of this green Catholic space. Italy is slightly above Polish case. It means that Italian society is a bit more secularized than Poland. Well, what is interesting that the US is lower on this vertical scale, so less secularized than Protestant European countries, although American GDP per capita is higher than those of Protestant European countries. We can say that he's one of the first, one of the latest is David Woas and his concept of secular transition, which is widely, I would say, even applauded. Because it is elegant, you will see whether it is only elegance or something more. According to this concept, Western countries undergo a secular transition, which started where almost everybody were religious, but with the process of modernization and weaker religious socialization, some children of religious parents will turn out moderately religious, what he called this form of religiosity fuzzy religious. And some children of fuzzy parents will turn out secular. And over several generations, this will have the effect that first fuzzy fidelity, fuzzy religiosity will rise and then fall over time until a majority of the population are secular. Well, there are very strong assumptions in this concept, but we can look at trends in 6 selected countries: Greece, Italy, United States, Western lands of Germany, Sweden, and the Czech Republic. And perhaps the most interesting will be comparing Greece with the Czech Republic. The Greece is the first one, the Czech Republic is the last one. In Greece, the cohort, this is technical term, we can say generation born in the 20s, in 20th century, consisted almost entirely of religious people. You can see this upper line with practically no fuzzy religious and secular people. It was at a very low, close to zero level. But the generation born in the 80s, in the 20th century, consisted of a little more than 60% religious people and more than 30% of fuzzy people with still low-level secular people. In the Czech Republic, it is this last example. From the very beginning, there was more fuzzy people than religious people, because the Czech part of Czechoslovakia, or this part of, was much more advanced in the secular transition than the rest countries. And generation born in the 80s is very much secularized. This is this red line. And this means for VOAS that Greece finds itself at the beginning of the secular transition, while the Czech Republic is close to the end of the process, whatever the end of the process means. Both countries do the very same thing. Difference is only in that Greece is somehow, I don't know, 100, 150 years behind. And for VOAS and also for other sociologists working in the framework of secularization theory, Poland would be a case of country that caught on in the secular transition process later, and therefore the secularization process is delayed. But according to this concept, it will proceed as it has already proceeded in other countries. As I already said, there are very strong assumptions in this concept of secular transition and many problems. I focus on three of them. The only difference between the countries is the point in time when a country embarks on the transition, but we don't know why and when does a country do so. What are the triggers? There are exceptions to the model, and the second serious question arises, under what socio-historical conditions will countries behave according to the model, and under what conditions the country will deviate? And what about the religious crisis of the 60s, which is well documented in sociological literature? Let's go to historical sociological approach, and this approach includes authors who emphasize the role of historically shaped cultural, social, and political factors, including this from mezzo level, political institutions, public institutions, and actions, decisions taken by these institutions. The authors working with this approach offer different explanation of the processes of change in religiosity. They present non-universal, non-generic regional scenarios of these processes, and they stress varying rates, varying rhythms, and even the direction of these changes. For example, Casanova in 1994 argued that there are processes of deprivatization of religion. In some cases, among these cases, these examples was Poland, what is well, not in a harmony with the theory of secularization. Also, Hans Joas is openly skeptical of a unidirectional and uniform process of secularization, and he refers to terms such as modernization, rationalization, and similar concepts, terms as dangerous nouns, because they, in a sense, make social reality rigid. He points to relatively short periods in which specific events, institutional actions, and political decisions had a secularizing effect. Examples for him are French Revolution, the period in Prussia in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the 19th century, or period in period of 1969-1973 in Western Europe. And what happened during these relatively short periods, according to his interpretation, set in motion waves of secularization. So there is no, let's say, constantly flowing process of secularization, but rather some specific periods that trigger the waves, each such period trigger the wave of secularization. Perhaps the most prominent exponent of this approach is Charles Taylor, who published in 2002 small book, The Varieties of Religion, William James Revisited. It is small book, consisted of 4, if I remember well, lectures, and it is a germ to his monumental work, A Secular Age, which has, I think, almost 800 pages. So if you become interested in this type of thinking and interpreting changes in religiosity, I would advise you to start with this smaller, shorter book, because there are beginnings of this monumental work, A Secular Age. And he distinguished 3 types of ideal socio-political religious order: Paleo-Durkheimian, Neo-Durkheimian, and Post-Durkheimian. Well, in Paleo-Durkheimian order, an individual is immersed in the cosmos which is penetrated by sacred or by religion, church. There is simply one religious or sacred cosmos, and the individual has no choice, although there are, as in all social groups, all societies, outsiders and heretics. In Neo-Durkheimian model, the state emerged as an actor, and church can be in alliance with the church or can be not in alliance with the church. So individual gains some choice. I have a longer quotation below. In post-Durkheimian order, there is no space for religion in the public sphere. Spiritual life is entirely privatized, in keeping what is important with the norms of a certain procedural liberalism and individualized experience of the spiritual. And here is this quotation. I try to make it shorter. In the course of modern history, confessional allegiances have come to be woven into the sense of identity of certain ethnic, national, class, or regional groups. The Polish and Irish Catholic identities are well-known cases in point. Throne and altar can't be allied because the throne is alien, not just when it is Lutheran, Anglican, or Orthodox, but even when it is Catholic, Vienna. He refers, of course, to Poland during the partition. Yes, the sense of national domination and oppression, the sense of virtue in suffering and struggle is deeply interwoven with the religious belief and allegiance, even to the point of such rhetorical excesses as the depiction of Poland as Christ crucified among the nations. Sorry for the mistake in crucified. This is the expression of great romantic Polish poet Adam Mickiewicz, this Christ crucified among the nations. The result is what I'm calling a neo-Durkheimian effect, where the sense of belonging to group and confession are fused, and the moral issue of the group's history tend to be coded in religious categories. The religious language is the one in which people find it meaningful to code their strong moral and political experience. The point of citing the different predicaments of Polish or Irish peasant or workers on one hand, and their Spanish or French counterparts on the other, is that the first offered inducement and little resistance to coding in a Catholic language, whereas life in a Baroque regime, it is such regime where the church and the state is allied, generates experiences that are strong deterrents to doing so. Sorry for this long quotation, but I think that it presents well this type of interpreting, let's say, secularization processes in different countries of Europe. Let's go to individual biographical approach. This approach uses qualitative research, biographical interviews, in-depth interviews, etc. It examines the processes taking place at the level of individuals, life experiences, identities, self-understanding in their close social environment, family, school, peers, parish. But such in-depth research can only cover individuals for small social group and from small size categories. The exception is Christian Smith, this is the American researcher, research and analysis. He published the book Young Catholic America, Emerging Adults in, Out of, and Gone from the Church. And this work is unique because he integrated qualitative research with a quantitative one. He started with a survey involving both teenagers between 13 and 17 years old and their parents. So he, at the beginning, had starting point in the family, then in-depth interviews at intervals of several years with these young Catholics to monitor religious trajectories as they move from their teenage years into adulthood. I cannot summarize, of course, this work, this research, but among other things, it was found that as they become young adults, Catholic teenagers either maintain the same level of faith and religious practice or decrease it, with practically no chance of increasing their faith and practice, and Catholic youth turn out to be less religious than youth of other denominations and religions. And there are three main areas of religious life that seem crucial to the development of religious young adults when they become older and older. So strong ties to highly religious parents, other adults and friends. This is one area. Then development of an internalized belief system that includes faith that is personally important because it forms of identity, individual identity, but also family identity, sometimes ethnic identity if they were from Latin America. And at the end, participation in religious practices, in religious services. Let's go to the Polish case. I prepared huge material about the Polish case, but I must, to make it shorter, you will have the presentation here, so you can look and the lecture, you can look at it. For a long time, and still, Poland has been regarded as a country which is an exception, in which the process of secularization does not progress or progress with a considerable delay and very slowly. However, for at least a few years now, relatively rapid secularization and the leading role of generational change in this process can be observed in Poland, which is documented by international studies and by CEBOS study. I would like to show you only some figures with trends, and I decided to show you dependencies of religious practice because they are stronger. It is more, the changes are more visible. Here you have declaration of participation in religious practices depending on educational level in quite almost 30 years, from 1992 to 2021. And you can see that the changes are more or less the same in each category of education. However, pioneers are people with higher education, and if I see well, in 2021, it is this red line. Only 35% practice regularly, and almost 30% does not go to church at all. The same is with place of residence. I divided the Polish society into two categories. Residents of the biggest cities, it is big five, Warsaw, Łódź, Kraków, Wrocław, and Poznań, and the rest of the society, the population. The first are represented here by solid lines, and the rest of the population by these dashed lines. And see, just at the end of this trend, in the biggest cities, there are more people not practicing at all. This is this red line going high. Then people practicing regularly. This is this blue line going down. Similar process can be observed among younger generations. Here I would like to show you religious faith as well as religious practice. Well, you can see that older cohorts, let's say generations, are quite similar to each other, and changes are really minimal. However, this yellow line, which represents young people born between 1980 and 1996, they are often called millennials, is going down. I mean, there are less and less believers and more non-believers. And among the youngest generation, born in 1997 or later, the change is radical. There are 30% young people declaring they do not believe. What is in Polish society not matter of course, let's put it that way. And the same is with regular, with participation in religious practices, and look at this red line. There are, let's say, a bit more than 20% of people in this generation going to church regularly, and almost 40% people in this generation not going to church at all. Well, so how can we explain it? Well, I would say that we have some, at least two approaches to choose from. First, we can look, we can look at certain periods, events. I would say the communist system, the times of John Paul II, and joining by Poland European Union. And these older generations I show you share this. For example, my generation, I do remember the communist system and its oppressive character. I witness teaching of personally, not from books or I don't know, articles teaching of Saint John Paul II, and perhaps it is vaccine against the secularization. For younger generations, it is just history or maybe even archaeology. John Paul II died in 2005. If we analyze very carefully these trends, we can notice, we notice that after 2005 there are at the beginning very slow changes, very slow decline of different indicators of religiosity. And in 2004, Poland joined European Union, and Peter Berger, who is very important in theory of secularization, spoke in 2007, so quite shortly after Poland joined the European Union, saying Poland is still significantly more religious than the rest of the European countries. It is still true. Will it succumb to European secularity? I think there will be strong pressure to head in that direction. In Europe, there is an emphasis on secularization. It would be highly surprising if Poland resisted this trend. Perhaps just as some EU countries did not adopt the euro, others will reject euro secularity. If this happens, it would be fascinating. Well, there is the difference between rejecting euro and rejecting euro secularity, but he thought that Poland bought well, everything, some model of living, joining the European Union. And let's think about more, I would say, systematic influences. And here I have in mind family, school, and church. Well, families, through the socialization process and through their, if the mother was practicing when a child was 14 years old, then it adheres to faith and practices to some degree. If she was non-participating, then the child is in over 45% of cases a non-believer, and in 2/3 of cases that does not practice, and here are tables. If a mother practiced at least twice a month, it is this blue or navy percentage. These are these blue or navy percentages. A respondent is a believer with such probability. If she did not practice in 45%, 46%, he is non-believer. With practice is, well, not the same, only if mother was very pious, practice usually several times a week. In 60% respondent practice regularly now. If she did not practice at all, 2/3 of respondents does not practice. So the process of transmission of religiosity from one side and inheriting religiosity from the other side is obvious. And it depends also on social environment. It is different when mother is highly educated, different in big cities, different with women and men, but religiosity of a child depends on religiosity of not only, but also on religiosity of her mother. Religious education at school, does it fails? Religious instruction, religious classes were introduced to schools in 1999. And CEBOS monitor this process from the very beginning, and at the beginning it was upward trend. In 2010, 93% of students of higher school, I mean this secondary education, participated in religious classes, but this number has declined since then. In 2021, it is only 54%, and perhaps this year the percent is even lower. Students rate these classes poorly. 71% of students did not find religious instruction classes interesting. They are boring, they said, or like other classes. So it is difficult to hope that such boring classes, like other classes, can fascinate young people. What's more, well, already involved in religious practices students participates in religious lessons. If he or she does not practice, in 2/3 they do not participate in religious lessons. So I would say that if someone has a religious background, these lessons can help maintain, maybe make this worldview richer, deeper, etc., etc. If someone has no, let's say, religious capital, it doesn't work because they simply do not attend these classes or attend as without any interest. Let's go to the church. Perhaps the institution is responsible for this state of affairs, for the abandonment of religious practices and departure from the church. Well, the younger the respondents are the earlier they abandoned religious practices, the youngest stopped going to church, statistically speaking, at around 16 years old. The sacrament of confirmation is derisively called the sacrament of farewell to the church. That's true. If a respondent declared that she had abandoned religious practices, an open-ended question was asked why. And there are, I would say, three broad categories of answers, of reasons. First, variously expressed lack of need and indifference to religion, to church, disbelief, change of worldview or religion, rarely atheism, agnosticism, very rarely statement that religion is nonsense, superstition, and a tool for stupefying society. I would say that these are personal reasons, and 36%, and there were 36% of such declarations. Then we have 40% of declarations pointed to the institution of the church as responsible for abandoning practices. And there were among these 40% vogue criticism of the church, sometimes very sharp. Well, for example, respondents do not like what the church is doing. The church is a mafia organization. There were specific accusations against the church, including its meddling in politics, and you have percentage in brackets. The pedophile scandals and their cover-up, only 5%. Its excessive solicitation of money, 4%. Lack of trust in the church and priest, and also the church message was judged by few as unattractive, unsuited to modern times, boring and even stupid. So this is this category that church as an institution is responsible for what is going on with participating in religious services, practices. To this 40%, 18% should be added, and respondents pointed to priests, to, let's say, personnel of the institution as responsible for their abandonment of practice. Once again, some were very generally worded, like general criticism, less frequently formulated but more explicit, is the accusation of hypocrisy. What they forbid, they themselves do. Or a specific situation such as expulsion from religious lesson or not being allowed to receive the sacrament. So I would say, summing up this analysis, that more often the church as an institution and priests are perceived as responsible for departure from the church than the subject itself. So rather, they are guilty responsible, but not me. Modest conclusions. Well, authors and researchers working within the framework of secularization theory have collected a mass of data and documented huge number of correlations between various characteristics of the society's studies, and you can check it show it in this last book of Inglehart, Sudden Decline. However, this huge material does not answer the question why it is so, and it is not a joke. There is also correlation between the average annual temperature and the level of religiosity. So if we have many features, many technically speaking variables, you can have almost any result. So I don't want to say this is not knowledge. I want to say this is the description only which do not answer the question why. Proponents of the hard version of secularization theory, I must say that David Martin, whom I mentioned at the beginning, distinguish hard version of secularization theory and soft version of secularization theory. So this hard version do not draw conclusions from their own results, from the results of their own analysis. Well, if we look at the map developed on the basis of Inglehart's analysis, if we look at trends in VOA's secular transition analysis, well, we easily notice that it is not so that religiosity depends on, and it is not so that this process is universal, or there were, if you remember, ups and downs in this religious, fuzzy, and secular people and proportion of these categories. Well, I've mentioned about the United States, which is much more religious than Protestant countries, Protestant European countries, and although the GDP per capita is higher, United States is more traditional, a bit more traditional, and adheres to less modern values, I would say because of history, because of, tradition. Soft version of secularization theory allow to take into account historical factors, and there are some examples I skip right now, and authors working in the framework of this softer version of the secularization theory explain, described societies, countries through individual narratives tailored to historical, social, and political realities, in essence through history. What is close to this historical sociological approach, the difference between soft version of secularization theory and, let's say, original historical sociological approach is essentially that theorists and researchers working within the framework of the former, this softer version, try to fit their description into the general framework of secularization theory, saying, well, maybe it is not one process, maybe there are many processes of secularization, maybe not one river, but many streams. However, they follow the same direction, the same route. And proponents of historical sociological approach abstract from these general trends or negate general negate general trends like Hans Joas, for also Jose Casanova, and offering instead historically rooted and sociologically in-depth explanation. But it is necessary to recognize the danger that exists in both softer version and historical sociological approach of slipping into a purely historical description. Well, about the individual biographical approach, I've already said much. I would add that there are a great many studies. I would name them micro studies that comprehensively and insightfully describe people's religiosity, the quality, the stability or change, etc., etc. These studies generally cover small categories or small groups. I can give you some examples. This year was the Congress of Polish Sociological Association, and our chair panel among many panels on changes of Polish religiosity. And there were really excellent presentations, I mean, very interesting, fascinating presentation, for example, about people who have filed for church divorce and how they relate to God, to the church, to their divorcee, to their family and close friends, or the other example about highly educated women involved in religious small groups, religious communities, who feel being in a fortress, attacking from one side by, let's say, progressive secular culture in which they work because they are highly educated, and from the other side by rigid, not open, maybe even oppressive church. And reading such essays, descriptions, we have the impression that we do understand these people, these communities. The problem is that they cannot be generalized to broader social categories, and much less they tell us about the process of change in religiosity, because they are, well, let's say, small monographs located in time and space, social space. Coming back to the case of Poland, well, I must admit that certain documented changes in the religiosity of Polish society fit the theory of secularization in its hard version. People with higher education are less religious. Are they more rational? This is my attempt to explain it. I wouldn't say so. For example, they read and follow horoscopes. Residents of large cities, because they are highly educated, because they are more anonymous in these biggest 5 cities. There is a German expression, Stadt Luft macht frei. City air make you free. Perhaps they feel free from religious reglementation of life. Religious reglementation of life is the concept of Max Weber. Young people, because they are more competent in new technologies, I really don't know. But it is documented that these categories are less religious. The theory of secularization in its soft version allowed to take into account specific local factors. I said already about the communist system, pontificate of St. John Paul II. The problem is that these specific factors came from history. They had the character of historical events and bring this approach, this softer version of theory secularization close to the historical sociological approach, which brings deep and meaningful insight into the religiosity of Polish society. I give you the example in this long quotation from Taylor, but he's not the only one. The really serious problem is that there is not, perhaps cannot be, this is the problem, that perhaps it cannot be a more general algorithm, in quotation marks, to guide such historical sociological interpretations for countries or regions. If I were to be tempted to come up with such an algorithm for Christian European countries and for Poland, I would point to the Reformation, the relationship between national and religious identity, and the relation between civic and political identity and religious identity. In Poland, this would be the defeated, in quotation mark, of the Reformation. So a state church could not be formed, as in England or in Scandinavian countries. The formation of a strong relationship between national and religious identity during the partition. So an alliance of the throne and the altar could not be formed, because throne was even hostile from time to time, and the role of religiosity and the church in resistance to the communist system. And perhaps we should add to this chain also pontificate of St. John Paul II, also joining European Union by Poland. It has to be considered and analyzed. I have no ready-made answers. And I want to stress that this is not universal or general algorithm. As I say, it is only for European countries to check whether the Reformation was present and strong in a country, to check whether it was like in Ireland and Poland, or like in France and Spain, where people, the nation, was against throne and altar as one, supporting each other, and also whether a country was lucky to be under the communist, in the communist bloc, and perhaps some other crucial points in history of these countries. I can't say anything about, for example, China. Casanova did. Well, I think that it needs well, historical, sociological, political, and church focus analysis. Well, about the individual biographical level approach, I've already said much. I can only stress that there is no study even close to Christian Smith's research on young American Catholics. Let me end with, once again, quotation from Peter Berger. Social trends do not function on the basis of inevitability, which is independent of ideas and human action. Modernity as such is no force of nature, but the result of the practices of human acting and thinking in a specific way. There is therefore no pre-established necessity according to which modern societies must, as a matter of essence, be secular. Whether they become such is a matter of our action, the conscious decisions of individuals, unforeseen consequences of these choices, and also the struggles for power and influence between various groups. And this is the end. Thank you for your attention.
Professor Grabowska, thank you very much for your lecture. And now we are open for questions. So please use the mics. Sister Helen. Yeah, no.
So thank you, Professor, for your interesting lecture. And I would like to ask you about one thing that is in the back of my head. I have this impression that theory of secularization is falling into the trap of thinking that if someone says that he does not identify with institutionalized religion, he's falling into some kind of religious void, that he's not having or she's not having any kind of religious or spiritual beliefs. And we know from the postmodern theorists of religion that it's not like this, it's more complicated. And someone is dropping institutionalized religion, but he's believing into some kind of transcendental force, or he's practicing meditation or other kind of praxis that is involved with spirituality and with beliefs. And I would like to ask you if you know any kind of studies that are going into this field of the beliefs of people that are not any longer identifying with institutionalized religion, but there is some kind of other spirituality or other kinds of beliefs that they are still holding.
Research, because the topic became fashionable. It is not a critical remark. However, well, I would say that I don't know, and also there is article analyzing the concept of spirituality, and the author found 64 ways of understanding this concept. I don't know what spirituality is. And well, I think that religion is connected to a group, and it is not, well, it is individual spirituality. There is no individual religion. Coming back to this, let's say, standardized research, it is simply easier to ask about indicators, many indicators of institutionalized religion. I limit myself to 2 indicators: declaration of religious faith, and now I should stress that it is declaration. We have no tools to see respondent soul, and declaration of going to church and regularity of this practice. However, for example, Ronald Englehart take into account also daily prayers, how important is God in your life, etc., etc. So it is not as narrow as I presented it. So it is institutionalized religion, but it is indicated by different features. So I think it is relatively good description. And there are such new phenomena which are, I would say, extensively researched and analyzed with very modest results. Perhaps because it is so difficult to catch by simple sociological tools, and perhaps because it is so individualized that it is distinct, not similar to religion. We can say about well, spiritual experience vis-à-vis nature or vis-à-vis music or vis-à-vis art in Rome. But is it religious experience that I don't know? There are many, and in lecture I will put it in footnotes. There are many such research.
Thank you, Madam Professor, for this well, amazing lecture with many data. As a student here in Angelicum and student of JP2 Studies, I was just, well, I do have many questions, but two most important would be the first, is the secularization only the thing in Western civilization? I mean, can we say something about the secularization of Muslim countries, for example? Or is it only the thing of Western civilization? That would be the first question. And the second, because if I understood correctly, there are not many indicators or factors in which we can say that, okay, this is why the secularization process happened. But if I understood it correctly, there are some moments in history after which the secularization is faster or harder. So can we say that such kind of moment could be like revolution, technological revolution, communication revolution? I mean, making things short, can we say that, for example, media crisis of the church are somehow responsible for the growing number of secularized young people in Poland? Thank you.
First question, well, you are right that this process of secularization going on mainly in Western countries, so Europe, the US. That's why I try to use the concept of changes in religiosity, because, for example, in Latin America, there are changes, but not secularization, but let's say shifting towards Pentecostal movements and church, and also other newer denomination. Muslim countries, if there is some kind of secularization, it is marginal. And that's why, for example, in a very famous book by Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart, they concluded that although there are some countries that are secularized, but world as a whole is more religious because of demographic factor, because of Muslim in Muslim countries the level of birth level of this indicator is much higher than in Europe and in the US. So yes, secularization is going on, but with some, well, serious exceptions, and these exceptions are Muslim countries. As far as once again, you are right that there are, let's say, two interpretation of secularization process. One as, let's say, stable, going on well, without ups and downs. And the second, that there are special events triggering this process. And such events are French Revolution, the 60s, etc., etc. To be honest, I personally try to check whether this technological generation is less religious because of its involvement in technology, new media, etc., etc. Until now, I didn't find any trace of it, but it is the direction in which analysis should go, in my opinion, that perhaps internet and this internet cosmos well, is too attractive and too, in a sense, big and constantly present and much more interesting for young people than sacred cosmos. But right now I have no such evidence.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your very intriguing lecture. I would like to say two things. First thing is I would like you to comment on the research of the Pew Trust, especially the 2017 study, The Global Landscape of Religion. I think it's definitely called Global Landscape, it's in the title, because of the way in which it shows that there's such a high proportion of people belonging to a recognizable religion, not people just saying, I feel spiritual, but belonging to Christianity, Muslim, Hinduism, and so on. And that the trends are actually positive, that we expect to have fewer people who are secularized in the future than now, because the number one factor is the fertility rate of women. And religious women tend to have more children than secularized women do. So their study tends to suggest quite a different approach or a sort of image of what's going on. They say most of the secularized people in the world are in China. They're not in the West. You know, this kind of thing. So I'd be interested what you think about this study. Secondly, I'm also thinking about the interesting discussion you had about religion classes. And you were saying that on the one hand, people were saying religion is boring and this sort of thing, the classes are boring. But there was also quite interesting correlation between going to the classes and still practicing your religion. Now, of course, which way is the causation, or if there's any causation, we don't know. But I mean, it was quite interesting. It made me think about something I've thought about a lot before, which is, you know, to some extent, in these kinds of studies, we tend to sort of think about religion as a kind of a thing. And of course, the teaching can be different. The teaching could be modified to present Christianity in a way that's dealing more with, especially, what's happening to this new young generation. I mean, it's so striking in the statistics that you show that there's this basically flat level for all the previous generations, then suddenly it goes down in the most recent generation. So it's a really striking phenomenon in the Polish case. And I wonder whether we have a chance here. You know, if you think about these young people, they're very subjected to a lot of business advertising, especially because of the technological things. The main thing that Facebook and Twitter and all that are trying to do is keep you looking at their screen so you can see the advertising. So these people are seeing a lot of advertising. And a lot of the business advertising is to do with being free. You know, they like to say, you should transgress, break all the rules, you know, be yourself, you know, don't be defined by anything. And the thing that you were saying about they don't like the institutional aspect of it, you know, that's also connected to this, let me be free kind of thing. And I think we could present Christianity as the most powerful form of freedom there is in the world, you know. It's really about setting you free to have a Christian belief. If we could get that across in the teaching, you know, I think this could be quite interesting. So I'm just interested in your reflections. Obviously, you're not going to say a lot about it being a sociologist, but, you know, from your just looking at it as a educated and interested human being, and obviously with all your sociological competence, that would be interesting to hear. Thank you.
Well, there is research also on global scale by Pew Foundation showing changes in religiosity in many countries, and Poland is among these countries. It is perhaps the other example of their findings among countries in which changes are quicker than in many other countries. They define the young people as 40 years old or younger. And despite this, well, quite broad category, they find, well, really big gap between this younger category and older categories. So I cannot, well, let's say, integrate this to research both on global scale, and I would advise you, because it is free, to look at the Pew Research Center reports from their research. As far as this young generation is concerned, well, it is like galloping toward or from the church, and I think there are many. I think that what you said about being free as the opposite to Max Weber concept of regulation role of religion in life is very, very important. However, why this? They want to be free of everything, not only of church and religion, but also of family obligations. They don't want this youngest generation. They don't want to work very hard. They want to express themselves and realize themselves. This is this concept from Inglehart. But I would add to this picture also that in Poland it is specific situation. There are very active, let's say, progressive, well, first of all, political parties, but also progressive circles and progressive celebrities, which are constantly present in media, showing that they will not baptize their children, that they will not send their children to religious classes, etc., etc., etc. It is publicized, it is commented, it is during prime time in some TV station, etc., etc. There is no information about, I don't know, religious, about people with living religiosity, living faith, because it is, I don't know, boring, not interesting at all. But this is constant presence of, I would say, anti-church and even religion contents. Let me give you one example. We ask after each election, we ask about whether a respondent witness political, ideological contents in the church during Holy Masses, and the less frequent respondent participate in Holy Masses, the most often he or she noticed that there was some ideological contents in teaching in the church. And the most critical were those who do not participate in at all, who do not participate in Holy Masses. So from where they know? From media, that it happens. The same with pedophile crimes. We ask whether it is an important problem in the world, in Poland, and in your parish. In the world it was very important, in Poland it was important, but in my parish it was not important. So, I mean, it is what they hear and see in media, which are much more present in our life than, let's say, 20 years before.
May I speak about? I would like to speak about two actors of process of secularization, which first is connected with a kind of a tacit presupposition, which I see in most of theories, that secularization has nothing in common with certain kinds of persecution. So there is a kind of, let's say, in most cases it's combined with a modernization, with a welfare state, with social support, etc., etc. But very rarely I see that they show a connection, like in Czech Republic, where all priests were arrested in short time, yes, and almost all seminaries were closed. And I don't see in the reflection on secularization, for example, the persecution and then the, let's call them silent persecution in France as an important factor of a secularization. You talk about the, I mean, we talk about the ideas, about the enlightenment, etc., about rationalization, but never about power and brutality. That's, I mean, that's an observation. Would you agree? The second thing, it's a problem of actor and the reason. Would you agree that it's worth to consider that the process of secularization is foreseen by abdication of a church in the sphere of culture? Because in Poland, that's what I see very clearly, that secularization follows, because I mean, I agree that the reason is quite unclear in Poland. I mean, nothing special happens. Of course, we can refer to John Paul II, etc., but I mean, there was no persecution, nothing spectacular happened, there was no certain point of development, I mean, nothing very clear. But definitely, around 20 years ago, so about the beginning, church practically express its disinterest of popular forum, culture, in many aspects. In the time of my youth, church was a place of culture, church of creating influential ideas, influential events, etc. Now it's completely gone from that sphere.
I would say that what you said about persecution has long history, and it started in Czechia in the 17th century, because Protestants were killed or emigrated after 1620. And Catholicism was reintroduced by the state. So when the Czech Republic gained independence, what Czechs did? Destroy figures of Saint Mary and Saint Święty Nepomucen. It is a Czech saint during from the period of Counter-Reformation. So for them it was something alien, and it allowed the communist power to did what they did. For example, Primate Beran was kept in prison, I don't know, many years. I think then he emigrated to Vatican because he was not allowed, perhaps even being a priest. So I would say that these are layers of persecution or political decision which create the situation that what was possible in the Czech Republic was not possible in Poland, not to that degree, not so intensely as in the Czech Republic. I would say that some historically oriented sociologists, of course, take these periods and persecution seriously. What I said about this soft version of theory of secularization and historical sociological approach, of course, these two approaches take into account such decision as, for example, secularization of public schools in France. What the author of this decision is known by name. It was one political decision. It was introduced, point. So such decisions to secularize the schools, for example, to put almost all priests into prison, of course, influence, but it should be in such an algorithm take into account. Whether church abdicated from, let's say, cultural ambition, I would say that during the communist times, obviously after 1968, there was an empty space. There was no communist ideology, there was only communist power. And so there was the space and there was, I think, really very active role of priest and the church as an institution. But after 1989, we are talking about Poland, the situation is different, and church has to compete with many actors and many cultural milieu, which are, at least some of them, really very anti-church, anti-clerical, and it is a completely different situation. Perhaps you know better and you try to act in this direction. I don't know whether church abdicated or was so involved in many, let's say, processes with introducing religious classes to school, with concordat, with anti-abortion law, etc., that simply church thinks or priests think that there is no time for culture, and perhaps in future, but future is dark.
Thank you.
Professor Grabowska, once again, thank you very much for your lecture, for fruitful discussion. And I would like to invite you to some special events. An open seminar with Professor Mirosława Grabowska to be held tomorrow, Thursday at 10:30 a.m. in Aula number 14. And the next Wednesday, the lecture by Professor George Weigel on his new book, to sanctify the world, the vital legacy of Vatican Secundum, which will take place on the 7th December, 4:30, here in this aula. And the next GP2 lecture to be given by Antoine Ariakowski, Religion and Politics from Totalitarianism to Democracy, the case of Ukraine, on 21st of December, 4:30, here in this aula. Thank you very much.